Hey everyone, welcome to the show. Ever feel like to get your voice heard, you have to break the mold, like the rules are rigged? That's kind of how I felt reading a More Perfect Party. It's a political biography, but it's like so much more. It's by Juanita Tolliver, and it's about the audacity of Shirley Chisholm's 1972 presidential campaign. She was the first black woman to ever even try to run for president. So we've got excerpt from the book ready for this deep dive. Oh, and the link to the full book is down in the description below. And hey, if you're liking these deep dives, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Okay, so Shirley Chisholm, first black woman in Congress, first to run for a major party's nomination. I mean, groundbreaking doesn't even begin to cover it, right?
Yeah, totally. And what's so cool is how Tolliver goes beyond just like the headlines. She really shows all the layers of Chisholm's campaign, the strategy behind it, the challenges, the impact. It wasn't just about winning, it was about like forcing America to look at its own biases.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the ways she did that was through some pretty unexpected sources of support. There's this amazing story in the book about a Hollywood fundraiser she had. It was at Diahann Carroll's mansion.
Oh, yeah, I loved that part. It wasn't just some celebrity thing either. It's about how celebrity was changing in politics. Like Flip Wilson, he usually didn't endorse anyone, but he did for Chisholm, so she reached audiences who might not have been paying attention otherwise.
Makes you realize she had to fight constantly for that recognition. The book talks about how she had to fight for media coverage to even be in the debates. She even had to fight for respect from her own party. She sued to get equal airtime on TV.
Seriously. Wow. That's crazy. It really shows how much the system was against her? And it's like that for so many people still today. It's the money, the media, it's like the old boys club. All those obstacles are still there. And sadly, it's a struggle so many women, especially women of color, still face in politics today.
Definitely. The book also talks about some of the issues within the feminist movement at the time. I was kind of surprised to read about the pushback she got even from some white feminists. It seems like they put their own agenda ahead of hers.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It's about intersectionality. Like racism and sexism, they overlap, create unique challenges. Chisholm was a black woman, so she experienced this directly. Some white feminists at the time were focused on things like reproductive rights and equal pay, but they didn't fully get the added layer of racism that Chisholm and other women of color faced.
Right, right. It's a reminder that progress isn't always straightforward. Okay, so before we go deeper into the feminist movement, I think it's important to understand how influential Chisholm was. Even before her presidential run, what shaped her into the force she became.
Oh, for sure. Her life experiences, the challenges she faced, it all went into her political outlook in campaign. There's actually this really powerful anecdote in the book. It's about Tolliver's own grandfather, who worked at the CDC during the Tuskegee experiment. He was evaluating the medical needs of people who were unknowingly exposed to syphilis. Can you imagine being connected to something so horrific? It's clear that it instilled a deep sense of social justice in Tolliver's family. And you can really feel that passion for justice when she writes about Chisholm.
That's intense. It's a reminder that understanding history is key to understanding our present, for sure. So speaking of history, how did Tolliver dig up all these incredible stories about Chisholm?
Honestly, her research is amazing. She found out about that Hollywood fundraiser we talked about from Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Lee was a total trailblazer, too. And get this, she'd actually convinced Huey P. Newton to get involved with Chisholm's campaign.
Whoa, wait, Huey P. Newton, as in the Black Panthers?
The one and only.
That's a wild connection, especially for a presidential campaign. Okay, so tell me more about this fundraiser.
It wasn't your typical political event at all. Picture it. Diahann Carroll's super fancy Benedict Canyon home. It was originally built by Barbara Woolworth Hutton, this heiress to the whole Woolworth fortune.
Wait a minute, Woolworth, like the Woolworth's lunch counter sit-ins during the Civil Rights Movement?
Exactly.
Wow.
So to have a black woman, a presidential candidate, hosting an event at a former Woolworth estate, it's a huge symbol, right?
It's like they were reclaiming that space. Okay, tell me more about Diahann Carroll's role in all this.
She wasn't just there to host, she was a real force in Chisholm's campaign. I mean, she was a trailblazing actress, starring in shows like Julia and Dynasty. She was known for demanding better representation for black women, refusing to be put in a box. Just like Chisholm, she was pushing boundaries and challenging how people saw black women.
They both knew what it was like to be a black woman in a world that wasn't built for them. They had to carve their own space, and they used their platforms to push for change.
Absolutely, and that's where someone like Flip Wilson comes in. In '72, he was at the top of his game. His show was huge, millions of viewers every week. He was hilarious, but he also pushed boundaries, especially with his Geraldine character.
Oh yeah, Geraldine, I remember her. She was controversial, but people loved her. What was it about her that made her so popular, and why do you think Chisholm liked her?
She embodied this unapologetic black womanhood that resonated with people. She was funny, sassy, and she was herself, no matter what anyone thought. Tolliver says Chisholm loved Geraldine's catchphrase, "What you see is what you get," because it reflected Chisholm's own style.
It must have been refreshing to see that authenticity in politics, especially at a time when women, black women in particular, were expected to be quiet and, well, just go along with things. But even with big names supporting her, I imagine fundraising was a constant struggle.
You're right, she was always outspent by her opponents. It's a problem that's still a big issue in politics today. The book talks about how campaign finance laws, or the lack of them, really favored the wealthy.
It makes you wonder how much has actually changed since then.
Yeah, I mean, she was running before Citizens United, and that just opened the floodgates for dark money.
It was already stacked against someone like Chisholm who didn't have access to that kind of wealth. It makes you think, how do we make a system where money doesn't determine who gets to lead?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Tolliver does bring up Obama's 2008 campaign as a potential model. They used small-dollar donations through online platforms and got a ton of people engaged. But even his win didn't solve the problem. All the dark money since Citizens United has made it even harder for candidates without rich donors to compete.
It feels like an endless cycle. And it brings us back to Chisholm and all the obstacles she faced. She connected with voters, but she just didn't have the money to compete.
Right, and it wasn't just the money. People were working against her from all sides, even within her own party.
Seriously. Wow. Could you give some examples?
Yeah, so right before she launched her campaign, some big political figures were already trying to discredit her, questioning her qualifications or accomplishments. It was like they wanted to stop people from taking her seriously before she even started. There's even this story about how New York Mayor John Lindsay told her she would split the progressive vote if she ran.
You're kidding.
Nope, they were clearly threatened by her candidacy.
Did anyone else try to stop her?
Yeah, Senator George McGovern, who was also running, told her to wait her turn. It's crazy how often women are told to wait, to step aside for the men in charge.
But of course, Chisholm wasn't having any of it. She knew she was disrupting the status quo, and she was determined to be heard.
Absolutely. She was a force to be reckoned with, and her impact continues to inspire people today. It wasn't just about policy or laws. It was about being audacious, challenging a system that was never built for people like her.
Her story is a powerful reminder that we can create change, even when it seems impossible. So how did she do it? What kept her going, despite all the challenges?
That's a great question. I think to answer that, we need to dig into the strategies and tactics she used during her campaign. Let's go back to that connection with the Black Panther Party.
Okay, you mentioned before that Barbara Lee convinced Huey P. Newton to support Chisholm through voter registration drives. How did that happen?
Well, Tolliver's research is really impressive here. She found out that Lee, who was a young activist back then, met Newton at that Hollywood fundraiser we talked about. Can you imagine being at that party? The conversations, the energy, it must have been incredible.
I bet. And the fact that the Black Panthers, known for their revolutionary stance, got involved in a presidential campaign is fascinating. It speaks to how powerful Chisholm's message was.
Totally. And their involvement went beyond just endorsements. They mobilized their organizers and registered tons of voters, especially young people who could vote for the first time because of the 26th Amendment.
So they were tapping into a generation that was ready for change, who were tired of the way things were.
Exactly. They understood the power of young people in driving social and political change.
So how effective were those voter registration efforts?
Incredibly effective. In California, Chisholm got way more votes than anyone expected, thanks in large part to the Black Panthers. It shows that combining activism with smart political strategy can create real change.
It's inspiring to see how groups with different approaches can come together for a shared goal.
It makes you think about what's possible when we find common ground, even if we don't agree on everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of activist organizing, as Tolliver calls it, has continued to influence campaigns, especially those led by Black women, even today. Can you give us an example of that?
Sure, Tolliver talks about Ayanna Pressley's win in Massachusetts in 2018. She beat a 10-term incumbent, which is a huge deal. And like Chisholm, Pressley ran a grassroots campaign focused on connecting with voters and inspiring a new generation of activists. It's proof that Chisholm's legacy is still alive today, that unbought and unbossed leadership still resonates.
That's incredible. It's amazing to see how her influence continues to spread. But it also reminds us that the fight for representation and equality is far from over.
Exactly. And that leads us to another point Tolliver makes, that tension between those who want to keep things the same and those fighting for a more inclusive system.
Yeah, it's frustrating that even within a party that's supposed to be about progress, there are people actively working against change.
It's a reminder that the fight for representation is never ending, even within your own group. Tolliver talks about how the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee made a blacklist after the 2018 midterms. They were targeting people who worked with candidates challenging incumbents, trying to protect the established power.
That's the exact opposite of what Chisholm stood for.
It really shows how far some people will go to protect their power, even if it means going against their own principles.
It's a sobering thought, but it also motivates us to keep pushing for change. We have to hold our leaders accountable and make sure they truly represent everyone.
Absolutely. And, while we're talking about coalitions and that Hollywood fundraiser, there was actually another fascinating guest there. David Frost, the British journalist.
Really? Wow, David Frost, like the guy who interviewed Nixon, what was he doing at a Shirley Chisholm fundraiser?
Yeah, well, he and Diahann Carroll were pretty close at the time. There were even some rumors they were engaged, and they often hosted parties together.
Wow, that's a pretty interesting connection.
Yeah.
What was Frost known for as a journalist?
He was really well known for his in-depth interviews and for being able to connect with all kinds of people. He could get anyone to open up and show their human side, even the most famous or controversial figures.
That makes his being at the fundraiser even more interesting. Did Tolliver mention any other connections between Frost and the people involved in Chisholm's campaign?
Actually, yeah, just a year before that fundraiser, Frost interviewed Huey P. Newton on his show.
Whoa, really?
It gave Newton a chance to speak directly to a huge audience.
That's a big deal, especially considering how the media usually portrayed Newton and the Black Panther Party.
You're right, they were often demonized and seen as a threat.
It makes you think about how much power the media has in shaping how we see things.
Absolutely. Media bias has a long and damaging history, especially when it comes to Black and brown communities. Tolliver brings up a Pew survey that found that most Black Americans believe news coverage about them is more negative than coverage of other groups. That kind of bias, often based on stereotypes and a lack of understanding, can have a real impact on how we see and interact with each other.
It's a good reminder to be critical of the information we consume, question what we see and hear, and seek out different perspectives.
For sure. And it's not just traditional media anymore. Tolliver also talks about how social media has made this problem even worse because hate speech and misinformation spread so easily online.
Yeah, it's like we can get trapped in these echo chambers where we only see things that confirm our existing beliefs. We have to make an effort to break out of those bubbles and expose ourselves to different viewpoints.
Absolutely. Now, getting back to David Frost, Tolliver actually points out another really interesting interview he did, this time with Shirley Chisholm herself.
Oh, wow. When was that?
It was on his show in 1969, so a few years before her presidential campaign.
So they already knew each other before that fundraiser.
Seems like it. And apparently, Chisholm was as straightforward and outspoken as ever, challenging Frost and this audience to rethink their ideas about women in politics.
I bet that was pretty radical for the time. What did she talk about in that interview?
Tolliver mentions this one part where Frost asks Chisholm if she thought the U.S. would ever have a woman president, and she said with no hesitation, "Oh, yes, yes, it's coming."
Wow, that's a powerful statement. I mean, this is decades before Hillary Clinton even ran, or even Geraldine Ferraro as VP. Chisholm really was ahead of her time.
She absolutely was. She envisioned a future where women wouldn't just be involved in politics, but leading it. And that interview with Frost helped to spread that idea and make it seem more possible.
It shows that progress takes time, and each generation builds on the work of those who came before. Speaking of progress, one thing that really stood out in Tolliver's book is how important it is to challenge the status quo, to not accept things as they are. And that's something Chisholm embodied throughout her whole life, right?
Oh, absolutely. She was all about shaking things up, and her message is still so relevant today. Tolliver even draws a parallel between Chisholm and a new wave of activists, especially young people who are demanding more from their leaders and pushing for a real systemic change.
It's so inspiring to see young people taking charge and demanding accountability from those in power.
It's really powerful. She talks about the protests after George Floyd's murder in 2020 as an example of this generational shift. Those protests were mostly led by young people, and they really challenged police brutality, systemic racism, and the very foundations of American society.
Those protests had such a huge impact, and they led to some real change, didn't they?
Definitely. They forced a national reckoning with these issues and led to police reforms and a renewed focus on racial justice.
And I think social media played a big role in those protests too, right? Did Tolliver talk about that?
Yeah, she points out that this new generation of activists is really good at using social media to get their message out and build support. They're using technology to connect with each other, organize, strategize, and bypass the traditional gatekeepers.
It shows how technology can be a powerful tool for social change. It helps movements spread quickly and connect people across the world.
It's true, but it's important to remember that social media can also be used to spread misinformation and hate speech. It's a double-edged sword, and we have to use it responsibly.
Yeah, you're right. It's not enough to just have access to information. We have to be critical thinkers and make sure we're getting our information from reliable sources.
Exactly. Now, to bring things back to Shirley Chisholm, one of the most important parts of her legacy is the impact she had on future generations of Black women leaders.
And that's where Tolliver's book really connects the past to the present and offers a sense of hope for the future.
Definitely Tolliver shows how Chisholm, even with all the obstacles she faced, paved the way for others to follow. She inspired countless Black women to enter politics, to believe that they could hold positions of power and make a difference.
It's so important to see someone who looks like you, who shares your experiences in a leadership role.
It can be incredibly empowering and validating.
It's like, if she can do it, maybe I can too.
Exactly. She broke down barriers and proved that Black women were not only capable, but deserved to be leaders. And her influence is clear in the growing number of Black women serving in elected office today, from local government to Congress to the vice presidency.
It's amazing to see how far we've come since Chisholm's time. But there's still so much work to do, right?
You're absolutely right. Tolliver talks about Kamala Harris's historic election as vice president in 2020 as a sign of progress. But she also acknowledges that Black women in politics still face huge challenges, like racism, sexism, and double standard.
It's a reminder that the fight for equality is far from over. We can't get complacent.
Tolliver talks about how Harris, despite being so accomplished, has faced intense scrutiny and criticism, often based on stereotypes.
It's so frustrating to see those same tired biases being used against Black women in positions of power.
It shows that we need to keep challenging those narratives and demanding more nuanced and respectful representation of women in the media and in society as a whole.
We need to be more aware of these biases and actively work to dismantle them.
Absolutely. And Tolliver ends her book on a really hopeful note, emphasizing the power of collective action and the resilience of those fighting for a more just and equitable world.
It's a reminder that even when things feel impossible, we can't lose hope. We have to keep fighting for the world we want to see.
And she argues that Chisholm's legacy isn't just about what she accomplished, but about the possibilities she created, the doors she opened for others to walk through.
It's a powerful message that we can all learn from. So let's talk about some specific examples of how Chisholm's legacy is alive in politics today. One thing that really struck me in the book is the rise of this new generation of Black women leaders who are unapologetically themselves, embracing their identities and refusing to conform to expectations.
It's so refreshing to see. We see this in figures like Ayanna Pressley, who we talked about before, and Congresswomen Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, the first two Muslim women elected to Congress.
These women are changing what it means to be a politician. They're bringing their lived experiences to the table and fighting for policies that address the needs of marginalized communities.
And they're not afraid to speak truth to power, even within their own party.
It shows that real change often comes from those who are willing to disrupt the system and challenge the way things have always been done.
Exactly. Tolliver points to the Squad as an example of this new wave of political activism. It's a group of progressive congresswomen of color.
Yeah, the Squad has definitely made an impact in Washington. What are some of their main policy goals?
They're pushing for things like Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, and criminal justice reform, issues that have often been ignored by the establishment.
Those are some big progressive ideas. I bet they've gotten a lot of pushback for being so outspoken.
Oh, definitely. Tolliver talks about how they've been attacked online and even by some members of their own party with racist and sexist comments. It just shows that the fight for representation is still going on, and some people feel threatened by these new voices.
It's disheartening to see those attacks, but it also shows that these women are making a real difference, shaking things up and challenging the power structure.
Absolutely, and their courage and determination are a direct reflection of Chisholm's legacy, that unwavering belief that a better world is possible. Now, beyond individual leaders, Tolliver also looks at how Chisholm's influence has shaped politics in other ways. For example, she talks about how intersectionality has become more important in political discussions and activism. It's the idea that we can't talk about things like racism, sexism, and classism separately. We have to recognize how they all connect and affect different people in different ways.
It's about understanding that our struggles are linked and not isolated from each other.
Exactly, and Chisholm understood this instinctively. She saw how her own experiences as a Black woman were shaped by both racism and sexism, and she fought for policies that address those interconnected systems of oppression.
And it seems like her vision is finally gaining traction, right?
Yeah, we're seeing more and more organizations and movements embracing intersectionality and recognizing that true liberation requires addressing the needs of all marginalized groups.
Can you give us an example of a movement that embodies this intersectional approach?
The Black Lives Matter movement is a perfect example. They've been incredibly effective in raising awareness about police brutality and systemic racism. But they've also been vocal about the need to address other injustices like economic inequality and LGBTQ+ rights.
It shows the power of recognizing that our struggles are connected and that we're stronger when we fight together.
Absolutely. Now, another important part of Chisholm's legacy is the focus on grassroots organizing and getting people involved at the local level. Remember how we talked about the Black Panther Party's role in Chisholm's campaign, registering voters and mobilizing people? That approach, building power from the bottom up, has become even more important today.
It's about empowering people in their communities to make their voices heard and create change.
Exactly. Tolliver highlights the work of organizations like Stacey Abrams' Fair Fight Action, which has been fighting voter suppression, especially in Georgia.
I've heard so much about Stacey Abrams' work. It's amazing.
They've registered tons of new voters, educated people about their rights, and challenged unfair voting laws in court. And their efforts have made a real difference. They helped with the Democratic wins in Georgia in the 2020 election and the 2021 Senate runoffs.
Wow, that's incredible. It shows what's possible when you combine grassroots organizing with strategic political action.
Absolutely. And it all comes back to Chisholm's famous quote, "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair."
It's such a powerful message. It's about taking charge and not waiting for permission to participate in the political process.
Exactly. We have the power to create our own space, demand to be heard, and fight for the changes we want to see. Now, before we wrap up our discussion on Shirley Chisholm, I want to touch on one of the biggest challenges she faced during her campaign, something that unfortunately still affects Black and brown candidates today. It's this idea of electability, or rather, the perception of it.
Yeah, it's a tricky issue, often based on hidden biases and a resistance to candidates who challenge the norm.
Exactly. Tolliver explains how people constantly question Chisholm's ability to win, not just her opponents, but even some people in her own party.
It's frustrating that even those who say they support progress and equality can fall into those traps of limited thinking.
There was this idea that a Black woman, no matter how qualified or experienced, just couldn't get enough support to be president.
It's a dangerous and damaging assumption, and it keeps those same systems of inequality in place.
Absolutely. And a lot of the media coverage at the time focused on her perceived weaknesses instead of her strengths. Tolliver points out how headlines often emphasize Chisholm's outsider status and her uncompromising nature, making them seem like problems instead of assets.
It's a classic example of how the media can influence public opinion and reinforce biases, especially against candidates who don't fit the traditional mold.
Exactly, and this whole issue of electability has hurt Black and brown candidates for a long time. Tolliver brings up the 2020 Democratic primary as an example where Kamala Harris, a highly qualified candidate, faced those same doubts about her ability to win.
It's so disappointing to see that those patterns are still happening, even after all these years.
Some people said she was too progressive, too ambitious, that white voters wouldn't be comfortable with a Black woman as president.
It just shows how far we still have to go to overcome these deep-seated biases.
And that perception, fueled by the media and political commentators, ultimately played a part in her decision to drop out of the race. It's a reminder that even though we talk about living in a post-racial society, implicit bias and prejudice still affect how we see who's fit to lead.
We all have to work on recognizing and addressing our own biases, individually and as a society. We need to be willing to challenge those narratives that limit our understanding of what's possible.
Absolutely. We have to question our assumptions, challenge the story that limit our thinking, and support candidates who represent the diversity of our country.
Because true progress means expanding our idea of who can be elected, who can lead, and who deserves a place at the table.
Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about another important part of Chisholm's legacy, her impact on the feminist movement.
It's a topic that often gets oversimplified, so I'm curious to hear Tolliver's take on it.
She does a great job of explaining the different types of feminism that were emerging in the early 1970s and how Chisholm's perspective both challenged and enriched the movement. We talked earlier about how Chisholm often disagreed with white feminists who prioritized things like reproductive rights and equal pay over concerns about racial and economic justice.
Right, it seems like those disagreements came from fundamentally different viewpoints.
Exactly. Tolliver argues that this disconnect was partly because of a lack of understanding about intersectionality, how issues like racism, sexism, and classism overlap and affect women differently depending on their race, class, and other identities.
It shows that even within movements working towards the same goals, there could be blind spots and power imbalances.
Chisholm, drawing on her own experiences as a Black woman, pushed for a more inclusive and holistic approach to feminism, one that addressed the needs of all women, not just white middle-class women. And her vision, even though it was initially met with resistance, has had a profound impact on the feminist movement.
It's inspiring to see how her ideas have shaped the way feminism has evolved.
We see it in how intersectionality has become more central to feminist theory and activism, recognizing that true liberation means addressing the interconnected systems of oppression that affect everyone.
Can you give us some examples of how this shift towards intersectionality has played out?
Sure, Tolliver highlights the work of contemporary feminist scholars and activists like Kimberly Crenshaw, who actually coined the term intersectionality, and Bell Hooks, who wrote extensively about the importance of race, class, and gender.
These thinkers have really helped to broaden our understanding of feminism and challenge those traditional, often exclusive narratives that have been around for so long.
They've been essential in expanding what feminist activism looks like, including things like criminal justice reform, economic justice, and LGBTQ plus rights. It's a reminder that fighting for gender equality isn't a separate issue. It's connected to all these other social justice movements, and we need to work together to dismantle the systems that oppress everyone.
It's about seeing the connections between our struggles and working together to create a fairer world for everyone.
Absolutely. Now, another crucial aspect of Chisholm's impact on feminism is her emphasis on the importance of Black women's voices and leadership.
Yeah, that's something that often gets overlooked in mainstream feminism. We need to acknowledge the contributions and perspectives of Black women within the movement.
She understood that Black women had a unique perspective to offer, one that was often ignored or silenced, and she refused to be pushed aside. She spoke out forcefully about the challenges facing Black women and demanded that their voices be heard.
And her courage and determination really opened the door for future generations of Black feminist leaders.
Abdel Tolliver talks about how Chisholm inspired a whole new generation of Black feminist thinkers and activists who built on her work and broadened the movement's scope. She mentions organizations like the National Black Feminist Organization, founded in 1973, which focused on issues specific to Black women. And she discusses the rise of Black feminist scholarship, which has helped us understand the complexities of race, gender, and class, and giving us new ways of seeing the world.
It's a testament to how powerful Chisholm's vision was, that unwavering belief that Black women's voices matter and their leadership is essential for true liberation.
Now let's shift our focus a bit and talk about another group of women who, while not always agreeing with Chisholm, played a big part in shaping the political landscape of the 1970s. I'm talking about the white women who also ran for president. It's fascinating to think about how, even though they came from different backgrounds and had different political styles, they were all challenging the same patriarchal norms and expectations.
It was a time of huge change, and these women were leading the way.
Tolliver focuses on two examples in particular: Patsy Mink, the first Asian American woman elected to Congress, and Bella Abzug, this really outspoken New York congresswoman who is known for her work on women's rights and peace. Both Mink and Abzug, like Chisholm, faced a lot of obstacles and skepticism from the political establishment.
It seems like a common theme, right? Women in politics being labeled as too radical or too emotional just for daring to challenge the way things are.
Exactly. But despite the pushback, these women kept going, campaigning across the country, raising awareness about the issues they cared about, and inspiring others to get involved. Tolliver talks about how Mink, who was of Japanese descent, faced discrimination her whole life. She was denied entry to medical school because she was a woman, and during World War II, her family was forced into internment camps.
Wow, that's awful. It just shows the systemic barriers and injustices that women, especially women of color, have faced throughout history. Those experiences must have had a profound impact on Mink's political views.
Definitely. They fueled her commitment to fighting for social justice and equality for everyone. And Abzug, who is known for her bold style and sharp wit, was a fierce advocate for women's rights, peace, and economic justice. She was one of the founders of the National Women's Political Caucus, which worked to get more women elected to office, and she was a vocal critic of the Vietnam War.
It's amazing to see how these women, despite their differences, were united in their fight for a better world.
Even though neither Mink nor Abzug won the presidency, they left a lasting mark on American politics. They helped pave the way for future generations of women leaders and showed that women, regardless of their background or political beliefs, could be powerful forces for change.
Their stories are so inspiring. It's about never giving up on your dreams, even when things seem impossible.
And one last point I want to make about these white women candidates is that it's important to recognize the complexities of their relationships with Chisholm. As we've talked about, there were definitely tensions and disagreements, especially around issues of race and intersectionality.
Right? We have to acknowledge those differences and understand the historical context that shaped their relationship.
But Tolliver also points out moments of collaboration and solidarity, showing that despite their differences, these women often united in their fight for a more just and equitable society.
Yeah, those moments of collaboration are so important. It shows that even when there are disagreements, we can still find common ground and work together towards shared goals.
For example, she talks about how Chisholm and Mink worked together on legislation like Title IX, which prohibited gender discrimination in education, and how Abzug supported Chisholm's efforts to get funding for childcare programs.
It's a reminder that even within movements, there could be both conflict and cooperation, and that building coalitions means navigating those complexities and finding common ground.
It's a lesson that's especially relevant today with our increasingly divided and polarized political landscape. Chisholm's story reminds us that progress isn't always a straight line, and that to create a more just and equitable society, we have to be willing to listen to different perspectives, find common ground, and work together towards shared goals.
That's such a powerful message, especially now it's about listening to each other, bridging divides, and finding ways to work together to create a better future for everyone.
Okay, so as we wrap up our look at Shirley Chisholm's legacy, let's go back to that moment you mentioned before, her appearance on Meet the Press just before the 1972 Democratic National Convention.
Yeah, it was the first and only time she was on TV with all the other Democratic candidates, right?
Exactly. I had to fight hard to get there. The networks initially tried to leave her out, but she sued them and won the right to equal airtime.
Wow, she had to go to court just to be included.
It just shows the kind of barriers she was up against and how determined she was to break them down.
Absolutely. And once she got on that stage, surrounded by all those powerful politicians, she totally held her own.
Oh, absolutely. Tolliver describes how she spoke with so much clarity and conviction, laying out her vision for a more just and equitable America. She didn't hold back at all. She criticized her own party for its shortcomings and called for a radical redistribution of power.
It's incredible to think about how forward-thinking her ideas were, both in terms of policy and her vision for a more inclusive society.
She was a true visionary, and even though she didn't win the nomination, there's no denying the impact she had on that race.
For sure, her candidacy really shook things up and made people confront issues that had been ignored for too long.
Tolliver argued that she forced the Democratic Party to look at its own biases and acknowledge the need for more inclusion and diversity. She paved the way for future candidates, especially women and people of color, who would challenge the system and demand their place at the table.
It's a powerful legacy that we can still see in politics today.
Absolutely. Now, one last thing I want to leave you with. Shirley Chisholm's story isn't just some historical event. It's a living example of the power of courage, conviction, and believing that change is possible.
It's a story that's so relevant, especially now. It reminds us that we all have a responsibility to fight for what's right, to challenge injustice, and to work towards a more just world.
We all have a role to play in shaping the future. Our voices matter, and we can make a difference, no matter how difficult it seems.
So what can we take away from all of this?
Chisholm's story is a call to action. It's a call to look at ourselves and the systems we're a part of, to challenge injustice wherever we see it, and to never stop fighting for a better world.
And to never forget, sometimes you have to bring your own folding chair. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive into Shirley Chisholm's amazing journey. We hope you were as inspired and challenged by her story as we were. We want to hear from you. What resonated with you most about her story? Share your favorite part of the book in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into fascinating topics. Thursday Say 881.